What is up, everybody? Welcome to the DFS MVP Championship Round edition. This is our final podcast of the 2021 season. We will have Super Bowl single game content up, but as far as DFS MVP contest goes, podcast goes, this is the last one of the year. As always, I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 444.com. With my co-host Ryan Noonan. Today will not be a Bills postmortem only show. We will get into everything for this slate. Before we get into that, Ryan, what is going on in the betting world over at 444?
Well, first, it's been a pleasure, Teach, to be on this little playoff journey with you. I wish we were still talking about the Bills. Again, we did that before we hit record. But yeah, everything is good in the 4for4 worlds. Obviously the DFS game, as far as football goes, stops. But we are doing some DFS content on the golf side now, which is nice.
Yep.
We are, have a little bit of that in our betting preview. It's kind of one of our guy Ron PGA Splits does about as good as it gets out there in the industry from a preview standpoint. That it's got encapsulating betting and DFS. So, but lots of other sports coming. We actually going to have NASCAR betting content on the sites as Daytona rolls into play here, I guess, in late February. So continuing to layer in new sports as you guys let us know you have interest in them. So Betting Sub is going to get you access to all of everything on the site, including all of TJ's DFS stuff next year. So definitely check it out on the site. It is the best way to take advantage of 4for4's subscription. It's compared to other stuff in the market. I know we are obviously massively biased, but if you just go to some checkout pages out there, competitors, and you're paying half the price.
Yeah.
And I would stand by our content with any of those folks.
Yeah, if you've been a long-time 4for4 subscriber, this year might be you might notice it's a little different in terms of when the new year starts. Typically, day after Super Bowl has been our new year. New year already started, so if you sign up for the 4for4 subscription right now, there is a slight discount, and that will get you all the way through February of next year. So whether it's betting, DFS, redraft, or you want to dabble in all of them, if you sign up now, you will have access through next year, through 2023, February 2023. So make sure you get that so you can get all that good PGA basketball, even NASCAR content going. Let's jump into small two-game slate, our last normal DFS slate of the season. Of course, Super Bowl, like I said, there is a showdown, but as far as we're concerned, the last slate of the season. Starting off the early game with what should be the high-scoring game, Bengals at Chiefs, and over-under of 54.5. Bengals are 7.5-point underdogs with an implied point total of 23.5. Chiefs favored by 7.5. 31-point implied point total is the highest on the slate. And probably not surprisingly, most of the chalk is coming from this game. We have 8 players projected for over 40% ownership on this two-game slate. 6 of them are coming from this game. So your normal players on the Chiefs side, Mahomes, Tyreek, and Kelsey will be very chalky. McKinnon might be the chalkiest player on the slate just because he's very affordable. And then likewise on the Bengals side, Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Joe Mixon, they will all be at or around 40%, if not higher. Not Burrow, because quarterbacks are a little bit different, but all those other players should be at or around 40%. And the Chiefs' defense will probably be the most popular defense on the slate just because they are the biggest favorites. They're priced a little bit below the Rams, so teams will be able to comfortably get the Chiefs in there, even if they're really stacking this game a lot. Chiefs will just make it into a lot of lineups. So as far as the chalk goes, any players that stand out that you like or don't like?
Yeah, I mean, you laid it out, man. It's like you even would think, all right, I want to get off of Jamar Chase because he blew up for 11, 266 and 3 scores. But like, it looks like T. Higgins is going to be just as owned because there's like $1,000 savings. So like, all the chalk is good chalk. I don't know that any of it is bad per se. This is such a game theory slate, and even that's kind of hard because we're so limited. And it's the opposite of last week where we talked about how it was going to be just so easy to kind of punt down the road and leave flexibility for late swap because of the Chiefs-Bills game. And now we have the opposite where everyone's going to be jammed in up front on Bengals and Chiefs because it's like 8-point total higher than – and it's really actually kind of hard. It's not even just that. I think it's a little bit hard, especially on the San Francisco side, to like really pinpoint how you would even like stack or onslaught that team. So that it makes it even easier to really build stacks in lineups here in this one. So I think it's all good chalk. I think the running back situation, especially on the Kansas City side, is an interesting thing. I think the McKinnon price is egregious. I think CEH looked pretty good and, looks to maybe could be trending into some of that early down stuff. So, but the McKinnon floor in the passing game, I mean, he basically had all the third down, all the long down and distance stuff, massive target share, which we absolutely love, especially full point on DraftKings. But if there's a scenario where if you're building thinking that the Chiefs are blowing them out, then maybe there's a CAH thing there. So I mean, on the chalk standpoint, TJ, it's all good chalk. I don't know how you differentiate because like you said, they're all 40 to 60% owned.
Yeah, I think it just kind of like, again, so many of the popular players are coming from this game. And again, like you talked about, this 2-game slate, the combinations are very limited. We talked about it last week. The 4-game slate was the main on DraftKings. If we go back to the wild card round, there's a 2-game slate and a 3-game slate, and we were talking about how the 3-game slate just fits our eye a little bit better. The 2-game slate, it's really just a matter of going out of your way to be unique, whether it's just with mega stacks or by leaving salary on the table. Like there's only 3 or 4 guys that are viable, like sub 15%, even sub 20% plays when the slate is this short. So I do think it's a good week if you haven't like dabbled a lot with lineup generators and setting types of rules, like locking in just like some mega stacks, maybe like 4 players from one team, and then something like leaving $500 on the table and seeing what kind of combinations you come up with. I think it's fun to practice that. But the point is, I think, like you said, all the chalk is good. So it's kind of like, where are these players most likely to succeed? What chalk might not go off as much as the other chalk? This one seems obvious, but the Chiefs passing game just is really hard for me to pass up on this slate. I mean, we do still have 3 other teams to choose from. So not every lineup is just going to smash lock every Chiefs player. But if we look at the fact that, again, McKinnon might be the highest owned player on the slate because he is so cheap, he's actually priced below CEH, and the rest of the pass catchers in this game are going to split ownership to some degree, you can still, whoever you like, whether it's Tyreek or Kelsey, really go overweight on these guys. Like I think it's, if they're going to be in 40% of lineups, it's not egregious to have either player in, say, 80% of your lineups or something like that. Cincinnati does pose the best on paper matchup for the Chiefs passing game. They finished 31st in schedule adjusted fantasy points to tight ends, 24th against wide receivers. That's the only defensive matchup of the whole week where a defense ranks in the bottom 10 in schedule adjusted points allowed in the regular season to any position. Every other matchup is above the top 10 or bottom 10, excuse me. So that should be very juicy for the Chiefs. I don't think anybody thought it wouldn't be easy for them, but I'm just really heavily stacking the Chiefs and their studs and really just trying to figure out from there. And then on the Bengals side, Mixon will be popular, but he is really priced up. So he's even though it's kind of weird because even though he's going to be a chalk play, he's probably going to fit into more contrarian builds because if you're playing him, it's going to get you off of either Chase or one of the big names on the Chiefs side of the ball. So out of all of those players on the Bengals side, I really do like Jamar Chase. His 18 targets are tied for the most in the playoffs among the remaining teams, tied with Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp, 18 targets through 2 games and 225 playoff yards without a touchdown. You mentioned he had that big game against the Chiefs back in week 16 or 17 or whatever it was. So hopefully if you're playing him, he has the chance to really go off again. As far as the players that we haven't mentioned, are there on any, I guess no one's really under the radar, but not chalk plays on either side that stand out to you?
Yeah, the Mixon thing's interesting. I could see him being a nice piece in stacks for the late game. You're looking to, get into that, but yeah, I mean, anyone that's not mentioned, like I said, I think the running back situation is interesting. If you were thinking that, I wish we were in a situation where we could get the box score bros and take advantage of kind of the reaction to week 17 because they combined, like Kelsey and Hill combined for 11 catches for 65 yards. That's really hard for those guys to do. 25 yards for Kelsey in a great matchup and, had volume, had receptions, had targets. They just didn't blow up. And that's kind of scary too, is to think that those two combined for 11 for 65 and the Chiefs still got 31 on the board. So maybe there's a way to get contrarian with the KC passing game where you maybe leave both of those guys off, which is really, really hard. But to your point, like, it's kind of what we have to do. We have to be extra uncomfortable here. That kind of solves two things at once. We avoid the ownership, and by naturally doing that, we either can leave money on the table more comfortably, or we leave more money to spend up on the late game, which is obviously going to be the lesser owned game. I mean, the Demarcus Robinson stuff is like, hold your nose, gross. But he's out there a lot. He was basically running wind sprints against the Bills because he was out there a ton. But the couple weeks prior, he saw a decent amount of action. The Pittsburgh game, he actually had 4 or 5 targets there and came down with a bunch of them too. Like, ideally you need him to get in the end zone. The Mecole Hardman stuff is a lot of gadget plays. Really hasn't had any real work in the last couple of months, other than when Tyreek was out in that week 18 game. He's been 35% snap rate. Byron Pringle probably makes the most sense. He continues to be out there the most in the 65 to 70% snap range. So that's probably an interesting way to still attack what we think is probably the best offense in the slates through the air. But again, I kind of go back to the CEH stuff. I think that McKinnon is such a good play, and he's cheap. He's so easy to click. Then the McKinnon stuff, if they just so happen to use him as they have been, which looks like a little bit more of an early down grinder, and we get into a situation where KC kind of runs away in the second half, and we're going to see maybe even 50-60% CEH instead of what we saw last week, which was like 35%. That's a nice little correlation with the KC defense that, again, probably isn't under-owned or isn't low-owned, but relative to the Tyreek stuff and the Kelsey stuff, it's probably a little bit more contrarian.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about a lot in DFS. We're playing for these outlier weeks and in tournaments. We're playing for ceiling and not necessarily median projections. But on things like a full main slate, the chalkiest players, they still often are the players that are projecting the best relative to the field and relative to their salary. And oftentimes those players still end up in winning lineups. Just because we have such a big player pool to choose from. And if we have, 4 or 5 players projecting very well above the field, those players, 1 or 2 of those players probably going to end up in winning lineups. When the slate gets this small, I mean, I don't want to say you throw projections out the window, but you are just really looking for extreme outlier scenarios for yourself to succeed. So I do like the idea that you mentioned of, if you're going to play Mahomes and getting really unique, going back to that game, seeing that both Hill and Kelsey underperformed, I think the way to maybe manage that, I don't know if I have it in me to leave both of them out of my lineup, but I think taking a stand on one of them and like maybe doing something where you triple Kelsey with triple Mahomes with like Kelsey, Pringle, and Mecole Hardman is very interesting. Pringle, as you mentioned, 7 targets per game in the playoffs. That's just 1 fewer than Kelsey. He'll probably be sub 25%. And Mecole Hardman isn't going to get, he's not going to get 10 targets. But as we saw last week, they're going to manufacture touches for him. And if, he scores on one play and it's a 65-yard rush or something, he can get you another 2 for 30 through the air. Like, you're probably in a pretty good spot there. So I think there are ways to go really heavy on the Chiefs side and hope that they do have just one of their players just score in a flash. And then on the other side, I mean, CJ Uzomah is kind of stands out as like one of the best leverage plays of the week. He's going to be the least popular tight end on the slate, especially on FanDuel, but he's actually out targeting T. Higgins in the playoffs. T. Higgins is probably going to double or even triple Uzomah's ownership. So I think including him in any type of stacks is a really good way to get unique. And then going back to what you said about CEH and how this game could play out, I don't even think it necessarily needs to be in a blowout scenario. CEH he played less than 25% of the snaps last week, saw 7 carries, while McKinnon saw 10 carries. Now, McKinnon saw 7 targets, had 5 catches, but my point is McKinnon doubled up CEH's snaps and only saw 3 more carries. So if somehow the Chiefs get into this game, again, you mentioned their 2 main players the last time they faced this team didn't do well, get into a game where they're leaning on the rush more than expected, I don't think we can ever project CH well here, but he does make a lot of sense if you're building a lineup that doesn't include Mahomes. If you're playing like Chiefs defense, or if you're heavily stacking the Bengals side or something like that, or not even heavily stacking them, maybe like, a Chase a chase double with Burrow or something like that, and having CEH as the guy that falls into the touchdowns, I think there is a chance that what we saw from McKinnon's snap share last week, that maybe somehow they end up running a little bit more than we expected. The likelihood of it, I mean, maybe 15%, maybe even less than that. But if that hits, I mean, that's what we're looking for in these super small tournaments, right?
And Darrell Williams is likely back, and I think that I think more than likely the way that plays itself out is that Darrell does nothing.
Yeah,
but
sure.
if he is to eat into someone's work, it's probably McKinnon, right? Because the way he's been involved as a pass catcher is going to really impact the way that McKinnon has been used, right? If you're talking about if we're on a normal, even a 4-game slate, like, and you're getting into just raw number point per dollar projections, McKinnon is a smash. Like, you just say, I'm playing him, I'll figure it out elsewhere. Yeah. But in this, we can't do that here. So we have to start to think about how these issues could play themselves out. So I think he probably is nothing as far as the impact of Darrell. But if he does come in and he is getting snaps, they trust him, and they trust him more so in the passing game, in blocking situations, chipping, falling out into the flat, things like that. So that's going to be more, at least how they've been used, is more McKinnon than CEH.
Yeah, and if he is involved in the game plan, it's probably a game plan where their running backs just as a whole, the entire backfield's being used a lot more than we expected, and again that could dampen the outlook of both Hill and Kelsey. Do you have just kind of a broad overview on this game?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be overweight on it, like you said. I mean, there's no scenario in which I just don't think that there's a blowout in the sense that it's like a 41-13 game. I think that even if the Chiefs roll here, we're still going to have a lot of production from the Burrow side. I just don't see a spot where, he's not, tossing it around. And they are really hard to get contrarian. Like, we can talk about 6 ancillary pieces on the Chiefs. It's pretty thin on, the Bengals side. There just aren't a lot of other guys that work their way in. So, I mean, Mixon, I think, is a nice way to get access to it. I think that there's not going to be a ton of ownership there. Again, in relation to some of the other guys in the slate, I think we're going to have a lot of Cam Akers ownership. You talked about McKinnon. I think this is probably more, especially on DraftKings, more of a 2 running back build with the way this is. So, 3 running backs. Sure. 3 running backs itself is contrarian. So that in itself might lead to less ownership on Mixon. So that's an interesting way to approach this game. And even though he's not seeing a lot of third down work, he is seeing a nice spike in passing down work on first and second down. And I think maybe there's a chance here where, based off of what happened in the first game in week 17, where they got lit up on the outside, that you still see a little bit more defensive attention that's going to be paid to them, that maybe leaves a little bit more stuff in the flat and then the intermediate routes for Uzoma, for Joe Mixon.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I think the predominant build, or at least by far the least popular build, will be 3 running backs. With Mixon so expensive, I just don't think many teams are going to have 3 running backs, whether it's saving salary by not playing Mixon, or I just don't think a lot of people are going to, especially the hand builds, I don't think they're going to want to put in Eli, Cam, and McKinnon in the same lineup. I just don't think that's how people are going to want to think around the shootout. And I think the way that I'm approaching this game is just like a Casey onslaught. Like, Mahomes has been done such a good job of extending plays. He just isn't going to take sacks, isn't going to throw interceptions. I know we saw him do those things in the middle of the season, but they've just kind of changed their offense so much to counter to what defenses were doing to them into the middle of the season. And we saw it these last couple of weeks. Like, if he has to rush for 50 yards on the first drive, he's going to do it. So I really like Kansas City onslaughts here. We saw last week in the Sunday special. I mean, I know that the points on the Bills side were crazily concentrated to Gabriel Davis, and you can't you can't necessarily project that, but so many people think in terms of, if this game does shoot out, then how are the lineups most likely to look, and then they just kind of want to be heavy on both sides. the winning lineup last week from the 2-game slate was 5 Chiefs with a Gabe Davis bring back and then just a couple players from the other game. So I like that on this side. One, because I think it can shoot out, and whether, if it's Jamar or T that hopefully gets all the points if you build that way, that helps you. But two, if there is a blowout, it's way more likely to be the Chiefs. So you kind of got like two things built in there where it can be concentrated on the Bengals side, or you have a KC blowout that can get you to that onslaught too. So I think I'm either going that way, or like a balanced build without Mahomes where I play CH, just a super contrarian play. I think is the other way I like to approach this game.
Yeah, I think the CEH and Mixon elements I think are relatively contrarian on the slate.
Yeah.
Like you said, even if you're building say 3 lineups, you have to have one of them, at least one of them, be a Chiefs onslaught. There's really no other way to do it. Obviously, as you start to get up there, diversify. If you're getting out there in lineups, it differs, but that should be the primary build.
Yep. So the second game, I think it will mostly be used for late swap more than anything, just because I do think people are going to have so many players from that early game that it's just going to be, I think it should be that way, that if you're building, you should just be waiting to see where you stand and using this game for late swap. But, we're still going to build our lineups, and hopefully if they're doing well, we can just leave them as they are. 49ers at the Rams. Over-under is 45.5. 49ers 3.5 point underdogs. Implied point total of 21 is by far the lowest on the slate. Rams favored by 3.5 at home. 24.5 point implied point total. And I do think this is interesting because the Rams actually have a higher implied point total than the Bengals, but there's going to be so much ownership on the Bengals. So I do think there is some leverage here. But before we get into that, the chalk plays in this game are going to be, it's really going to be Kupp and Akers. Kupp's not going to be the most popular player at his position because he's so expensive. So he'll be like right in that Hill, Kelsey, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins range. But Akers, he'll battle with McKinnon to be the most popular player on the slate just because they're so affordable on both sides. And then Elijah Mitchell will be propped up as a running back just because there's really only 3-4 running backs to choose from depending on how people feel about CEH. People are just looking at 3 backfields with workhorse backs, and then like maybe CEH gets some ownership, and then to a lesser extent Debo and Kittle will be owned, but they won't be near that 40% range like we talked about. Quarterbacks in this game won't be nearly as owned as the quarterbacks in the first game. So do any of these popular players that we mentioned here stand out to you? They just feel like, outside of Kupp, really, they feel like they're such a mile behind the first game.
Yeah, they are. Kupp, there's no scenario in which Cooper Kupp's not a great play. In any matchup this year, any scenario, any game states, we've seen it. He balls out, and really the strength of the Niners, we've been preaching, all playoffs here, is their run defense. They are second in EPA per rush allowed. They are second in success rates. They have multiple guys that rank individually in the top 5 in run stuff, win rate. They just elite unit, 10 yards to the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. So the way to attack them is through the air, and that obviously is Cooper Kupp, who is a smash. I want to get your take on the Akers stuff. Obviously, scoreboard watching, box score watching, 23 of 24 carries last week. If we want to get into a little bit more narrative driven stuff, 2 fumbles, one late where we really didn't see if there's an impact on workload after. And I think we've all been somewhat surprised. Well, first of all, the Cam Akers stuff in itself is just fucking insane, right? But then secondly, like to just Sony Michel, like he never existed. And he played pretty well. I know that he's not explosive. He's not as dynamic in the passing game as Cam Akers is, but for him to just kind of be a shoot to the sideline for nothing, now the dude's putting the ball on the ground twice in the playoff game. Do you think that there's anything to that here where we maybe see a little bit more Sony, and that makes Cam at 60% owned really hard to stomach?
Not even just maybe we see Sony because of the fumbles, but Cam's just been crazy inefficient too.
Yes.
And we've seen this running game be efficient with Sony Michel and even Darrell Henderson, who might get activated himself. So I think that it's not that I'm necessarily like gonna look to play Sony. I don't think he cuts into the work enough. I think more likely, you mentioned the 49ers run defense. I think more likely what we see is it's just the Stafford Cooper Kupp show. And that's how they just get the 49ers, and they just, let their front seven, their pass rush really get all over Jimmy in that pass game, try to, force them to run, with Eli or even Debo, but try to make Jimmy beat them. And I just don't think there's any way they can do that. If they get up quick with Stafford and Kupp, I think it's really the defense that they're going to be leaning on. So in that scenario, I think it's maybe more of just a three-man running back rotation. Cam Akers probably still leading the way by a lot, but that's just kind of a long way of saying I do think it's kind of hard to play him as the I shouldn't say hard to play him. There's only four and a half running backs to choose from. There's going to be lineups where he's just such a good value. You're going to
5K.
You're going to slide him in. But I think it's going to be hard to leave him off of all of my lineups. I think it's going to be easy to be underweight on him. I think rotating in McKinnon and CH to a lot of my lineups is going to be my primary build, and then my second running back will be either Mixon or even Elijah Mitchell. I think one of my favorite ways just to play this game is either and this is jumping ahead here, I think like a Stafford cheapish double. It's not going to be that cheap with Kupp, but like Stafford, Kupp, and then like one of his cheap pass catchers, and then just still loading up on that early game. We're just going super light on this game with Elijah Mitchell and the San Francisco defense and hoping for an upset because the Niners are supposed to have like 65% of fans there or something. So I do actually think there's a way where this game does end up in an upset in a defensive battle where it is either the Elijah Mitchell or Debo show. So yeah, I think you're not going to have a zero on Cam Akers because it's such a small slate.
Yeah.
But I think there's going to be a lot of builds where he just doesn't make his way into my lineup.
I mean, we got to tell ourselves stories in this slate, right? We did it in the first game. It's really more so than anything. We talked about in Showdown, you have to have your lineup tell a story. We definitely have to do the same thing in the 2-game slates. Yeah. And I can tell a story that I don't think is a stretch where Cam Akers continues to be inefficient, and that 95% workload is 65% against a tough run defense. Yeah. And, maybe he's limited to 2 to 3 catches, and that's not really I can get that for McKinnon. The problem is on DraftKings, they left Cam Akers at 5K. So
that's the problem.
It's not even like 6K or low 6s. And you'd be like, well, yeah, that's an easier fade. But I mean, it's really, really hard to do. So I can get behind that. I'm still stunned that this is 3.5. I mean, we can get into just plain old football narratives, but this is just fighters, styles make fights. And this is a bad matchup for the Rams. Yeah. We've seen it. We know that, the success of the last couple of seasons, what's happened this season. So I like the Niners. So, telling a story in builds that has the Niners not comfortably in front, but in a positive / neutral script is something I'm very comfortable doing. And there's a few things at play. I really want to be overexposed to Debo. I'm not worried about Elijah Mitchell. He didn't practice on Wednesday, was limited on Thursday. And I think he's been dealing with this knee injury since week 9. And last week we saw for the first time since week 9 that he had fewer than 21 carries in the game, was limited to only 17. Debo got up to 10. That's the closest that split's been all season. And then you also have this massive advantage on how the Rams play defense. No one played more zone snaps this season than the Rams did. That works really well because the route leader, the target leader against zone is Debo by a pretty massive margin. He sees 25% of the team targets against against zone, 19 against man. So a pretty big split there. And his yards per route run jumps from 1.87 against man all the way up to 3.54 against zone. That's massive. He's gone for 95 and 97 in the 2 matchups earlier just on receiving yards. And now we're laying in 8 to maybe 10 carries. I don't know. I think that he's a really nice way to get contrarian on the slate. And I think that he is the way to play a third running back because he's going to get a ton of carries there too. I love Debo. I love the Niners here, and I want to be a little short on especially the running backs on the Rams side.
Yeah, I think there's two ways I really like approaching this, and it's for a couple reasons. One, I think a Stafford skinny with Cup, just because Cup's
Yeah,
his target share is just out of control. A lot of people are gonna want to stack the first game. You could stack this with just these two guys, and kind of like we talked about last week. If the first game isn't insane, Stafford doesn't have to go bonkers. Like if Mahomes and Burrow just hit their median projection, then you can get there with Stafford if he hits his, just because of ownership alone. Cup has slate breaking ability, and it still lets you load up on a ton of guys for the early game. And on top of that, what having Cup in your lineup does late is it gives you a ton of flexibility for late swap. And it's kind of the same reason I like building around the San Francisco win narrative too, but I think building that very light. We know, or we're pretty sure, that Jimmy Garoppolo can't support two pass catchers, right? So they won 27-24 in the last week of the season, which is a shootout for these two teams, but it took overtime to get there. Mm-hmm. So we just don't, on this slate, Jimmy Garoppolo is by far the least likely quarterback to support two pass catchers. So I'm just not interested in stacking the 49ers side in a win. As you said, following the narrative, I think it makes a lot of sense to have like a Debo San Francisco defense, maybe throw a Cup in there, but like a Debo San Francisco defense. Even though I do like Mitchell, Debo just gives you, again, a little bit more flexibility in your salary. If you have him in your flex, you have San Francisco defense, maybe if you have another player from this game, it lets you have a little bit of flexibility in late swap with your salary. So I think I'm approaching this game from very, very light, but doing it with that idea that it is going to be late swap. Now, again, if you're building 20 lineups or 100 lineups, 150 lineups, like, sure, you're going to do some funky things with this game. Like, you might have a heavy stack on this game. That makes sense for like a CH Joe Mixon lineup, right? It makes sense to go heavy on this game. There are ways for the games to go off the rails if you're including Chiefs defense or Bengals defense in that lineup and go heavy on this game. That makes sense. If you're just doing a balanced lineup, you're going to have some of those. But if I'm doing a single entry lineup, or if I'm doing like a 3 max, it's going to be heavy on this game, and just with either that Stafford Cup or the Debo San Francisco defense pairing.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to do it. I think the one thing I would say that I think just in a vacuum, you're right about Jimmy G. He's not been able to sustain two pass catchers, but in the scenario where we're trying to get unique on the slates, and with the way that Debo is being used, he almost kind of works a little bit differently, where he's a little bit, he's flexible, where I don't mind, because again, where the splits are pretty massive in zone versus man, where you could go, Jimmy, Kittle, Debo, with Cup on the bring back. Again, it's hard because you're doing that knowing that you are playing Jimmy Garoppolo on a 2-game slate that involves Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow, who's, hanging 400 yards, 3 times in the last 4 games or so. So that is hard to get to. But again, we have to be a little bit uncomfortable from a game theory standpoint in these massive contests. Now, again, depends on your contest selection. If you're playing higher stakes, single entry, it's, a little bit harder to justify a Jimmy double. But again, if you were playing in some of these lottery contests, milli makers or things like that, that's a little easier to swallow, and try to find, like you said, Jimmy double, Cup bring back, and then you're bringing CH and Mixon in there and kind of, filling in where you need to. But otherwise, I think, you need to sprinkle it in support of the early game.
Yeah, my only problem, obviously, with Jimmy G, you're getting you're going to get way lower ownership than the other guys. Like, my only problem with it is you're not necessarily saving a ton of salary, because salaries are already like kind of, even on DraftKings, they've kind of made it where you can, for the most part, fit in whoever you want. You can't fit in like a Tyreek Kelsey Cup lineup, but our optimal has like either Tyreek or Kelsey with Cup, with Mahomes, with the Chiefs defense. So for the most part, you could already kind of do whatever you want. Which is why, like, if Jimmy G was like opening up the slate to where I can get to 3 studs and I couldn't without him, I think I would like it a little more. We never talk about Yahoo on here. I will say on Yahoo, he's priced so much below the other guys that it does let you do that. Like, their pricing is still really like aggressive on the high end, and he's way below the other guys. So if you're playing like the Yahoo Baller or something like that, I think it's a little more viable for me. Again, if you are somebody that's 150 maxing the milli, have a couple of Jimmy lineups, like by all means. But if you're playing like, the 7-7-7 with 100 guys, it's a tough. Yeah, I just don't. I don't see it.
No.
Any final thoughts on this 2-game slate? I mean, it's tough to just give like a single way to go. We both like stacking the Chiefs. There's only so many combinations, but any takeaways before we get out of here?
No, I wouldn't mind getting, a little bit heavier on the Niners in comparison to the Fields. Like you said, I mean, they are the lowest total. So that, naturally they're going to be, underdogs, and they're going to be less owned than some of the other stuff. But I mean, we talked about it all playoffs, is you got to be a little uncomfortable. If you click and you're looking at it and it kind of fits salary wise and you're barely leaving any money on the table and you really like it, I would just clear it and start again, because there's no way you're not running into a dupe lineup.
Yeah, I think my predominant strategy is going to be to go very heavy on that first game with the caveats that I talked about in the late game, like a Debo San Francisco defense or a Stafford Cup single stack, but just really loading up on that first game in some capacity and leaving salary on the table. I put a tweet out on my account yesterday that showed all of the top 10 lineups from a bunch of DraftKings tournaments last week, from the Saturday 2-gamer and the Sunday 2-gamer, and how much salary they left on the table. And there's not like a ton in the top 10 that are leaving like 1,000 on the table, but in the bigger field stuff, the range was pretty comfortable from like 300 to like 900. Again, in small field stuff, like less than 1,000 people, or even just like 2,000 people, it's not as extreme, but that kind of makes sense. The more entries there are, the more combinations are going to be, the more lineup combinations going to be, the more ways you need to get unique. Even on the 4-gamer last week, I had a couple of lineups where I was like setting rules to where I left at least 1,000 on the table. That was a little bit aggressive, but even in a 4-gamer, there were so many duped lineups that when my lineup scored, they were jumping hundreds of lineups at a time. So I think it's a really good idea just to think in terms of whether, like, obviously we're thinking in terms of stacking and stuff like that, but thinking in terms of ways to be really unique. And I think salary on the table is one of the easiest ones for these slates. Yeah.
And again, DraftKings in particular, I think 3 running backs is going to be a naturally unique build. So
yeah, that's a really good point.
That's going to be a spot where you don't necessarily have to leave a ton of money, but just that build in itself is going to be pretty contrarian. So
yeah, that's really, really smart. And something that I'll definitely be thinking about going into my builds. All right, that does it for championship round. That does it for the 2021 season. We'll be back at some point. Best balls are already kicking off, but more importantly, Ryan's heading up the betting side of things over at 4for4. Just make sure you're checking that out. Just a ton of off-season content over there. And we're not far away from NFL betting because they get those futures out pretty quick. So make sure you're checking that out.
NFL drafts.
Yeah. Amazing betting action on the draft. Yes. So make sure you're checking that out. If you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you subscribe to the podcast, no matter where you get your podcast. If you're listening on the audio, please check out the YouTube. Please rate and review on iTunes. Please like and subscribe on YouTube. Please give us a follow on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 Football. Ryan is at Ryan Noonan. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys next season.